Should the Democratic Alliance and the Economic Freedom Fighters get into political bed together to stop the ANC's proposed VAT increase in the now second attempt at passing a budget for the country this year in 2025? That's the question, because the African National Congress is still pushing incredibly hard to increase VAT higher than the current 15% that it is. VAT taxes and impacts on the most impoverished people the worst. And so it's still kind of extraordinary that we're witnessing the African National Congress push so hard for a VAT increase. Now we're in a situation where the country really needs a budget. The country really needs money. The ANC really thinks VAT is the answer, and the EFF may be the kingmakers. So let's talk about it. This is the issue with VAT, the DA, and the EFF. You're watching The Issue with Dan Corder. South Africa is a movie. Welcome to the watch party. And in case you still don't know, we have a Monday to Friday morning news worth knowing podcast called Dan Corder in the Morning. It's actually currently in the top 5 most listened to South African podcasts on both Spotify and Apple Music's podcasts charts. Go find us on Spotify, Apple, everywhere else. Just search Dan Corder in the Morning and join our WhatsApp community by saving the number 0607 613 436. Okay, let's start at the start. You know that countries have budgets, and every single year a new budget needs to be passed by parliament, by the government. Well, it's never really been a big news story in South Africa because since the dawn of democracy, the ANC has had such a significant majority in parliament that they just create, present, and pass their own budgets. But now, with the Government of National Unity, the ANC has to rely on other political parties in the GNU alliance to vote with them to pass acts of parliament, including the budget. Leading up to what we now know as the first attempt to pass a budget in 2025, it looked like they were just going to vote with the budget and the actions of government would continue for another year. But then, in the days leading up to when that budget speech was supposed to happen, there were murmurings and whisperings in the media that something in the budget was outraging not only non-ANC members of the GNU, but disturbing ANC leadership within the African National Congress. It seemed to be something to do with value-added tax. Now, if you don't know, value-added tax is a tax placed on consumption, which essentially means it's like a sales tax. Whenever any good or service is bought or sold, there's a little bit of VAT that needs to be paid by the provider of the product or service, the seller. What most reasonable businesses do when there is VAT is they just increase the price of the good or service that they are selling to cover the cost of VAT. So they make the same amount of money, and the government gets its value-added tax. But it's the consumer, the purchaser, who pays more for that product or service. Wealthier people, because they have more money flexibility, they can choose if they want to minimize the impact of VAT on their budgets by going and buying a cheaper alternative good or service than the more expensive ones that they would have bought before. But the poorest of the poor have to buy whatever they can afford. They're probably already spending on the cheapest available of those goods and services, and VAT increases the prices of even those things. And so overall, this kind of tax affects impoverished people the worst. And even if you choose to not levy VAT on certain basic goods and services to try and help the poor avoid the impact of VAT when they have so little money to play with at all, the problem is that increasing even all the other prices of goods and services in an economy leads to inflation. And inflation means that every single rand we have is worth less. And so impoverished people, even if they're purchasing goods that are not included in or affected directly by VAT, are still now trying to exist in an economic system where everything is getting more expensive because their rands are worth less. So in the days leading up to the budget, a lot of parties said that they would not accept an increase of VAT. And that's not just opposition parties, that's members of the GNU itself, including the Democratic Alliance. And then extraordinarily, on budget day, in the hours, just a few hours before the speech was supposed to be given by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, an emergency meeting was called. And we now know that that meeting was because the ANC's Finance Minister intended to push through a 2% VAT increase, which is massive. That is an enormous increase. They were trying to generate an extra 55 to 60 billion rand a year. And they were trying to do that because they had a 55 to 60 million rand hole in their budget. And many Many members of the GNU said no, including, and most significantly, the Democratic Alliance. And so no budget speech happened at all. It was postponed. And the roundhouse across the country condemnation of the ANC for trying to put through a 2% VAT increase was quite extraordinary. I haven't seen South Africa this united since the Springboks won the last World Cup. The DA agreed with COSATU. The free market-loving, pro-business, capitalist party, broadly, agreed with the most significant collection of trade unions in South Africa. And now there's this weird situation where the DA has had such a massive win in the eyes of the South African public, blocking the VAT increase from the last deal, that the DA is just crossing their arms and saying there'll be no VAT increase. But it seems like the ANC, led by Cyril Ramaphosa, wants some kind of VAT increase. Now, by the agreement that the GNU made amongst themselves, which is not a legally binding agreement, the ANC and the DA have to agree on something before it goes through in Parliament. But as I said, that's legally non-binding. So the ANC could go to another political party that has the votes, even though they are smaller than the DA, has the votes in Parliament to be able to push the budget through. Now, certainly not going to be the MK party because of how viciously anti-Ramaphosa's ANC they are and how non-negotiable they are about not working with them. But what about the economic freedom fighters? The EFF have the votes and the support to push this over for the African National Congress, plus maybe a little bit of spare change. Julius Malema insists that nobody is talking to the EFF about potentially going into a deal with them about the budget. But politicians have lied and misled in the past, and this could really be happening, or it could be about to happen. And so now we have this wild situation where the ANC may try to go to the EFF for a deal and give them other concessions, other political rewards for siding with them on the budget, on a reduced VAT. Now, the EFF will have to make their own calculation about whether or not that's a good idea. Considering how angry South Africa is about VAT, the EFF may not want to be perceived as being aiders and abettors, enablers of VAT being increased. But they could consider it, which leads to a different question. Should the DA go to the EFF and try to strike a deal that they will both agree not to allow for and vote with the African National Congress on a budget that includes an increase to VAT? Now, that might sound like a small deal if both parties have the same interests at heart to try and stop the ANC from increasing VAT. However, as I'm sure you know, the DA thinks that they're the angels and the EFF are the devils, and the EFF thinks that they're the angels and the DA are the devils. So any kind of political deal or hard red line, purple line, I guess, blue and red, in the sand, to prevent VAT between the two of them would be a really extraordinary political development in this country to avert what at least the DA thinks would be a far larger disaster. And you can only imagine what the EFF supporters, and I think the DA supporters, would think about those two parties getting into bed together with some kind of political alliance agreement. Now, they may make the calculation that they could do more damage to the ANC and be greater rewarded by their voters and supporters by preventing VAT from happening. But in reality, if the EFF helps the DA thwart this ANC-led VAT increase, then the DA still gets their massive win, and they are looking like the heroes, the effective politicians in government. And also, if the DA asks the EFF for help in this matter, and the EFF goes along with them, then the EFF gets to go, look, we were the power brokers in this deal, and even the DA had to come to us cap in hand. So we're about to see whether or not the ANC and DA directly can strike a budget deal. We're about to see whether or not the EFF is going to be pulled in for either side. But whatever is about to happen, there is about to be an enormous amount of work done from all the political parties involved to try and frame the narrative of what exactly is happening to cast themselves in the best possible light. Now, you may be watching and thinking after all of this, okay, but Dan, what's why are we fighting about this? South Africa needs more money. We need to plug the gap in our budget. We need to find the extra 55 to 60 billion. And that's where this becomes even more complicated, because SARS's commissioner, who's a presidential appointee, Edward Kieswetter, has said, no, you don't need to do that. We can recover that much money and more if you give SARS more resources to pursue tax evaders. You are probably also thinking, watching this, what about the way more than 60 billion rand per year that the South African government's budget loses to corruption, fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and the rest? And to that I say, you are absolutely right. And there are other kinds of budget alternatives that could be created to try and get this much money back from elsewhere. But it's a huge moment. It's another historic moment in another crazy, crazy time. South Africa in 2025 is on some kind of performance enhancing drug, not in that we're performing better, but in that we're doing so much. It seems like every week we've got a bombshell. Thank you for watching.